I'm just ready.
Good. Okay. You want to start the top left? Is it-
No, it says recording.
Oh, sorry. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Community Advisory Council meeting for April 3rd. 2023. The agenda for tonight. We're gonna do some changes. So rather than doing a roll call, we're gonna go around the table, starting with Tom, and each member of the council can state your name and the district that you represent.
District 2.
Hi, Evan Zelli here from District 4.
Marcy Flores, District 4.
Nancy Pemberton, District 5.
Lorena Barrera, District 3.
Nathan Solomon, District 1.
Thank you. And we don't have any members of the CAC attending the meeting and participating via Zoom, with any of the exceptions that are allowed for the Brown Act. So we'll move on to item number 2, the approval of the March 6th meeting minutes. And we'll start off by asking CAC members if there are any questions on the minutes. Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and open it to public comment. If anyone from the public wishes to speak on the draft minutes that were in the agenda packet and you wish to address the CAC, please come to the middle of the room. Okay, seeing none in the audience, do we have anyone on Zoom that has a hand raised? Okay, we don't have any comments or any hands raised on Zoom, so we'll bring it back to the council. Are there any final comments, or is there a motion for approval of the minutes?
Comments, but I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of March 6th, March 6th, 2023.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, thank you. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Oh, sorry, I all abstain, and Marcy will abstain as well.
Aye.
Okay, thank you, and I believe the minutes are approved. Next, we'll move on to openings and appointments. So at this time, we have 4 openings on the CAC. One in the 1st district, one in the 2nd, one in the 3rd, and one appointee from the director. So if you know anyone that's interested in joining the CAC, we are taking applications and welcoming people who would be interested in helping us get the work done.
And I did want to check, I think, have we been able to verify whether you have to apply to the district in which you live, or whether a community member can apply to any district? Have we confirmed that?
I have found out that the way Measure P is written doesn't explicitly say that a CAC member has to live in the district. It does have other qualifications, including being a Sonoma County resident. As a practical matter, I suspect most supervisors would probably prefer picking someone from their district to make sure their community is represented. But my understanding is it's not a legal requirement. I should also mention, I think we have identified someone for our vacancy in the 1st, and we're still finishing up processing, getting that person added in. So I don't want to get ahead of them and, jump the announcement, but I suspect that our next meeting will have someone here for the vacancy in the 1st.
Do we have other applicants that have applied in the last month, or?
We do have people that have applied to all the vacancies, and I would say, I think one of the things I'm experiencing is that many people who are interested want to spend some time doing some due diligence and thinking about whether or not they want to join and what they might want to work on if they joined, and what the history of the organization has been and potential is in the future. So on the one hand, that means we don't necessarily have a huge queue of people, so I think it's still good for us to be doing outreach and finding folks. But I am pleased to see that the people who have expressed interest so far are people who are serious enough about the work that they're really thinking carefully about their own ability to commit the time and what they feel they would be able to bring to the table and how they feel the work here might help them accomplish things that are important to them in their communities. And that's good to see. So I like that they're each taking their time to think about what this is really good.
Just off topic, can I check just inquiring whether our Zoom meeting is actually open for the public? I noticed that we only have one attendee from Watson Lab, where we normally have.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is a.
Since you asked, we're checking.
Okay,
To make
great.
sure that we can actually log in.
Okay, great. Yeah, usually there's more people, so I was just inquiring.
Good question to ask.
Thanks, sorry for. Yeah.
That's perfect because I always make a mistake when doing this. So in the meantime, I skipped over the commitment to civil engagement and the Design Team Alliance. So Nancy is going to go ahead and read that for everyone.
All are encouraged to engage in respectful communication that supports freedom of speech and values diversity of opinion. CAC members, staff, and the public are encouraged to create an atmosphere of respect and civility where CAC members, county staff, and the public are free to express their ideas within the time and content parameters established by the Brown Act and the CAC standard parliamentary procedures. Adhere to time limits for each individual speaker in order to allow as many people as possible the opportunity to be heard on as many agenda items as possible. Establish and maintain a cordial and respectful atmosphere during discussions. Foster meaningful communication free of attacks of a personal nature and or attacks based on age, disability or ability, class, education level, gender identity, occupation, race and or ethnicity, sexual orientation. Listen with an open mind to all information, including dissenting points of view regarding issues presented to the CAC. Recognize it is sometimes difficult to speak at meetings, and out of respect for each person's perspective, allow speakers to have their say without comment or body gestures, including booing, whistling. No whistling, but you can whisk. First topic. And all are the Design Team Alliance.
Progress.
Right.
Okay, all are encouraged to engage in respectful, non-disruptive communication that supports freedom of speech and values diversity of opinion. Our Design Team Alliance is a list of norms which describe the way CAC wants to show up and to be in the community while modeling collaborative behavior. We request that CAC members, staff, and the public follow the CAC's agreed upon Design Team Alliance, which is be tough on topic, not on people, respect others' perspective, respect time, practice active listening, be open-minded, speak to others as you would like to be spoken to, honor freedom of speech, and call each other in.
Thank you, Nancy. And while Nancy was reading that, we did test to make sure that the meeting is being broadcast on Zoom, and it looks like it is.
Great.
We all heard. Sorry for that interruption. So we will continue to move forward. So now we are going back to item number 4, correspondence items, and this time we don't have any items of correspondence to report out to the council.
And one.
Yeah, but that's for
We'll
a
go
specific
in.
item. Yeah.
The one we have, we'll discuss later.
So items that, when we refer to correspondence items, I guess from my understanding with our previous chair, is anything that we've received that the CAC kind of needs to be aware of. And then other items where we've received comments from the public in relation to something specific on the agenda, that would be considered public comment, and that is normally shared by staff with the entire CAC for consideration when we bring it up during the agenda discussion. So now we'll move on to item number 5, Sheriff's Liaison Report. And was that, do we have anyone from the Sheriff's Office present?
Yeah, my understanding was that our usual sheriff's liaison, Andy Cash, wasn't able to make it to tonight's meeting, and that they intended to send someone else to at least cover the staff data presentation. So hopefully we have someone coming here in just a moment. It's only 10 after 6, so hopefully they're gonna be here shortly.
Okay, thank you. So in the meantime. So at this time, we don't have a sheriff's liaison report until we have a sheriff's liaison or a representative from the sheriff's office present. And moving on to item 6, the first business item is related to that presentation. So to continue moving through the agenda, let's move to item B, the report and recommendation of the ad hoc committee on extremism. And is there a presentation?
Yeah, I mean, presentation's maybe too formal of a word, but,
Okay.
so, yeah, so our ad hoc, did put together, pretty extensive and thoroughly researched, set of, concepts, basically, let's just call them, a framework. And, that was presented, and I think everyone has that in their agenda, and I hope everyone read that. I'm not gonna read that through tonight, but what I would say is that, you know, we spent a significant amount of time looking at this. And the gaps that we found, I mean, we first went through the policy itself for new hires for Sonoma County Sheriff. And those actually looked really good to us. So I wanted to call that out first and foremost. The big gap that we noted, and this kind of, we noticed this right out of the gate really, was that there didn't seem to be a mechanism for identifying people who maybe were radicalized after hire. And so that was a big concern to us. And so I think a lot of our thought process in terms of the recommendations are based on that. So that was, I guess that was the big takeaway. You know, the gap, I would say the other question and kind of a open comment a little bit. We weren't super prescriptive about how best to verify this kind of activity. So we were kind of thinking we would put these recommendations forward and then work with Sonoma County Sheriff Ingram on some approaches, because there's different ways to do this. There's a lot of technology involved. And we were a little bit concerned that if we were too prescriptive about, you know, checking text messages or certain apps, that those things would become kind of outdated and therefore kind of immaterial to what they're doing day to day. So that was, I just want to point that out. We did get some feedback from Jerry 3 over email, and he had some comments, and I'll just table those for a second because I want to just go through this stuff first. But that's essentially our plan. And I would say, Nancy, if you have anything to add to that, feel free.
No, you're gonna address Jerry's.
Yeah, I want to let's just talk about this first, and then we can talk about Jerry's comments.
I think, you know, our concern is that there was the only way that once somebody was hired, the only way that it would come to somebody's attention that somebody had been radicalized and was engaged in this kind of extremist activity or conduct or whatever, that it had to come from a complaint, either, you know, internal or external, and that wasn't good enough, that we wanted something that was proactive, that was both because we thought that it was important to be proactive, but also to show that the sheriff's department took it seriously. And we thought that the attestation idea was one that would demonstrate on an annual basis that this was an issue that was being looked at seriously by the sheriff's department.
Perfect. Yeah. And then Jerry did mention some items in an email to us, kind of follow-up items. He was a little concerned about the biannual cadence and thought, you know, that was too maybe static and it should be random. I don't believe when we wrote this up that we had the concept of, you know, random, like I never intended for all audits to happen. And pragmatically speaking, I don't think that would ever happen. There's not enough, like no offense, but there's just not enough, you know, human resource power to do them all at once, you know, every 2 years. So the way I kind of just assumed it would occur is on a rolling basis, you know, you'd take 50 or 100 at a time and go through this. I also intend to follow up a little bit with ISD, because I feel like a lot of these, a lot of this audit could be automated. So, I don't believe, this needs to necessarily be a huge, labor intensive task. And so that was another kind of follow-up item for us, but, a little bit beyond the scope of the recommendations here. What was the other thing that Jerry said that was interesting?
I think he was concerned about the randomness.
Randomness, right? The cadence.
And also we addressed social media here, and he was concerned about text messages.
Right, that's right.
But I guess we could say any kind of, and messaging, electronic messaging, something like that, add
Yeah.
those words. We were using social media in a very broad way, because we didn't want to say, okay, somebody could use Signal. Is that going to be protected? Is WhatsApp going to be protected?
Right.
If we don't list it, is it not, if we just say text?
Yeah, we really wanted to cover all messaging, including text, but we didn't want to call out specific apps or methods of communication, because we just didn't want to get it carved out. If that makes sense.
But
Yes.
if people wanted to add, where it says, open their social media, we could say social media and messaging.
It seems like we may want to have it as broad as possible to, for, any, electronic communications. Rather than restricting it to social media, which doesn't include necessarily texting apps. And, once another app comes out, it's now excluded, if not included. Perhaps some language, including but not limited to all electronic communications, keep it as broad as possible. Where we know what it's applying to the electronic communications, but not such that it's restricting only to text or only to social media.
It's a good thought.
We could change the language to electronic communications, just change the word social media to electronic communications.
That sounds good. Yeah, more broad. I like that. That sounds like.
So are we allowed to do that with amendment?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll just, if there's no objection, we'll just change that language
Please.
to electronic. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add before we take questions from the council? Okay, we'll start with you, Tom. Do you have any questions only? Comments will be after public.
Okay. Exhibit A, I've got at the top, we were talking about things, at the top, you list a bunch, and the last two are, I was with a guy, but I didn't know he was in this. But the third one, number D, I don't catch the last 5 words. You've not intentionally denied or impeded the exercise or joint of any right, privilege, power, indemnity, knowing the conduct is unlawful. Well, if it's unlawful conduct, you would think you would try to impede it or keep them from exercising it. It's only if it's lawful conduct you would try. Or does the conduct relate to the officer and not the one? In other words, say, enjoyment of any legal right, power, privilege, or immunity. Is that what you're trying to say? And that would do it? Or I just don't understand that word.
Can you point me exactly to where?
Yeah, D. And it's the last part. It says you won't impede anyone's.
Page 4.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So,
Page 63.
Donna, can I just
Yeah,
respond to that?
sure.
This language was taken directly from their policies. So we didn't want to get into a
That's
disagreement about whether this is beyond what they're supposed to do. But my understanding is that you're not, if you don't know that you're impeding, you don't know that you're unlawfully impeding, that doesn't count. You have to know that your impediment is unlawful.
But it says knowing the conduct is unlawful.
But have not intentionally denied or impeded another.
So you have to know.
Knowing that.
You have to know that what you're doing is unlawful.
All right, I just,
I'll defer to the lawyers on this one.
okay. You might want to just ask them. Or not.
And also, we do have printed copies of the agenda packet for anyone interested. If you need one, they are on that table over there by that black case. Any other questions? Kevin?
No questions.
Marcy? Okay, I don't have any questions. Okay, so now we'll open up the item for public comment. So if there's anyone from the public that has any comments on this item, please step to the middle of the room and provide us with your comments. You have 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Jim Duffy. Real quick, I really like Evan's adjustment, and thank you for that, the broad language. I would hope that this would be something that once the audit function of IOLERO is fully staffed, that can be audited down the road. You know, so we're not just relying on professional standards, but IOLERO staff is doing what Nathan talked about. It's got to be a way to have this automated, you know, and something can be done, and you just look at the electronic communications for some keywords. Because that's how they seem to be catching everybody who gets caught doing this around the country. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this is a great step in the right direction and something that can move towards even more. I think I agree with Jerry. I like the idea of being more proactive and random in how we do it as a backup to the attestation. But I think reminding people of the policy and having to sign off on that, knowing that if they lie, that's grounds for termination, is strong. And I also appreciate, Nathan, what you're saying about the electronic means of tracking that down, because I think, you know, law enforcement should know how to do this. They do this all the time. So I'm sure the tools are out there. So thanks again.
Thank you. Seeing no one else from the room has any comments, do you have anyone on Zoom? Okay, so we'll close public comment and bring it back to the council for a discussion. Do you have any?
So my concern, and I'm just wondering if prior to taking any action with this, if we should have a conversation with our sheriff's liaison. I know that if this is something presented, it's likely going to sound some alarms with the unions. Anytime we're asking their officers to attest to additional things as part of their employment. I think it would be a good idea to try to maybe have some discussions with our liaison before presenting it to the sheriff, just so it's not simply, you know, rejected on site. There may be a way to find out early on what parts of this they will agree to or not agree to, and perhaps some negotiations that can take place so that we're not sending something that's just going to be rejected automatically.
It's a great idea. Great thought. I'm thinking we should include, I mean, Sheriff Ingram as well, and not just the liaison, just to have all the stakeholders in the room at the same time would be.
It's good.
And just so you know, we did meet with Andy Cash about this. We went through all of and with Brandon,
We did, and yeah, but I think
but not the recommendation.
not the final product, right? So it was more of a, yeah, we kind of walked them through what we were noticing as far as gaps, but we didn't have this document ready for them to look at. So I totally agree with you. Thank you. Yep. Okay.
Did you have any, Marcy?
I might add something, sorry.
Okay.
Following up on Evan's point, I would imagine that a proposal like this, we need to at least get some advice about whether it's going to be subject to the meet and confer process with the unions. So that could be an additional step that happens here, and sheriff's personnel will be able to talk to us a little bit about that as we're moving forward. And given the conversation about an interest in finding an automated way to do some of the auditing work over messaging, I could add that I know that the San Francisco Police Department has been trying to do that for the last few years, and came up with a system that is automated, that generates an initial set of responses, and then they have actual human beings look through those materials to see if any of them are truly materials to be worried about, or whether they're false hits. I mean, you can imagine almost any search term that you might think of, there's going to be the potential that it might come up with communications that are otherwise innocent. So they've had at least some experience with trying to narrow down the field and use some automated tools in that regard. I don't think they've been terribly satisfied with the outcome, but there might be lessons there about what not to do that might save us some time.
Okay, that's great. So does that mean we should talk to county council then, as far as the meet and confer, or is that?
I think as we go through the next steps of talking to the sheriff's office about how to implement this, and whether to implement it, county council would have the ability to provide advice about whether the ultimate proposal would be subject to meet and confer or not. And I think anytime we're putting together policies, it's a good idea to get advice about that when we're getting close to implementation.
For sure. And should we include HR people in that as well, or county council covers it? You think?
I think county council would probably cover that.
And do you have any people in San Francisco that you could refer us to?
Off the top of my head, I would say that the last I had heard, it was their internal affairs division that was doing that work, but I don't know who's the head of that unit right now. But we could find out, so I'll help you with that.
Can I ask one for clarification?
Yes.
So Evan, are you suggesting we not vote on this tonight and go talk to the liaison before we? Or do you want to say this is a recommendation and we're going to then negotiate?
Well, I think before presenting it to the sheriff as a policy recommendation, we should try to perhaps speak with them or county council or, sheriff's representatives regarding the meet and confer, because once we approve it and present it to the sheriff, if it's like many of our other recommendations, they may just simply ignore it. Or not reply or do something else. Having discussions with them ahead of time may kind of allow us to see whether they are open to something like this, whether it's going to be a fight in getting a recommendation like this approved. But more importantly, as John referred to, we don't want to make a policy recommendation that they just look at and say, this violates meet and confer, can't do it, and then again, just ignore us. So I think it's a good idea to determine whether it will get the attention it deserves before approving it.
Okay. Any other comments? I was only going to ask if anyone thought it mattered that we have a section or not only putting the employee name, but saying like do solemnly swear or affirm that in the past years, serving as, and that they put their position on there. I don't know if that matters. Because the reason that I thought about it was that maybe there might be sometimes situations where certain individuals in certain positions have some kind of duty that kind of triggers something on here. So if they state what position they were in, it might be justified in some form. I don't know if that's important, but it was just a random thought. I have seen some oaths where people do have to state the position and when they took that oath, and then it could change when they do it again. So maybe we can look at that. Does that make sense? No.
I'm not sure.
So like, let's say that someone serves as a, in the courtroom and has to escort somebody out or something, and then they're, I'm just making this up, accused of, maybe there's a pattern of the people who are escorted out of the room and someone accuses them of that, but we have an oath saying that during that time, they weren't associated with any group. Basically, they're just adding that as an explanation of them doing their job in that position. As like a court deputy or something versus a lieutenant, or am I making sometimes?
I think so, but say you're undercover. If you're undercover and part of a motorcycle gang and you violate this, is that what you're trying to?
Yeah, something like that.
And
I
I'd be
didn't know
against-
if the undercover part would be too extreme,
Well, I mean.
like in my description, I watched
Okay.
it, so.
So this says accepted, specifically directed and authorized by the sheriff's department
Where is that?
as in F. All of this is directly from their
Manual.
manual, which doesn't limit it to their role.
Okay. On a personal basis, okay,
I think because they changed roles so much, you wouldn't want to limit it to their current job.
yeah, make it more.
And they might have multiple roles.
Yes.
Yeah,
during the year.
yeah, that does make sense.
Mhm.
Okay, that was my only comment. Otherwise, I think this was great. And on the agenda, we did write that we would discuss the item and take action, but if we're not formally recommending this to the sheriff's department, then I guess our action it does for the ad hoc to go back and conduct the research necessary for us to bring this back as a formal recommendation to the sheriff's department.
Works for us, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, and I'm gonna say, if we can. But we don't have a liaison for the next two meetings. He's retiring in October. And so there's only, if we can't get some immediate cooperation, I'd like to bring it back regardless of.
So next month, we'll bring it back. And we'll make every effort to reach out to Sheriff Ingram in the next month here and.
That sounds good. So I don't think we need an official vote on this item. So we'll close that item out, and before moving on, do we have anyone from the sheriff's?
No, I did just get a message from the sheriff's office. It was very apologetic, saying that their usual liaison, as I mentioned earlier, they knew couldn't be here, and they intended to send someone for the stop data and failed to arrange for somebody else. They did promise to make someone available to an ad hoc, and I know we were talking about creating an ad hoc on this topic later tonight. So they seem sincere in that regard, and we do have some materials in the packet. I have a few observations about those, if that's useful to share. We could have at least a little bit of a discussion, even if we don't have a full presentation.
Okay, I think that's appropriate. So
Okay.
I'll move back to item A and turn it over to John.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, there are some materials in our agenda packet that talk a little bit about the Racial Identity Profiling Act of 2015, also known as RIPA, and some of the data that's now available about stops made by the sheriff's office. Because I'm not obviously involved in the sheriff's gathering of this data, and we only have the one report so far that's quite recent. I can't vouch for all the data, but I can share a few observations that I picked up from talking to colleagues in oversight in other places about how one might start thinking about this data and about some of its pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, what it does and doesn't tell us. First of all, it's important to understand that the Racial Identity Profiling Act of 2015 included language that required all law enforcement agencies to eventually collect data about who is stopped by law enforcement. This is not just traffic stops, but any kind of detention. Traffic stops are only one of many different kinds of detentions that an agency might engage in that is then supposed to be collected and reported in this process. And in that regard, it's capturing data from a really wide variety of law enforcement activities. So we get some fairly large bulk numbers about stops made by agencies, but not necessarily a lot of data about what sorts of activities cause the stops to happen in the first place. And those are going to vary a lot from agency to agency and depending on what activities they do. So it is very difficult to compare these against other agencies because the functions tend to be different. That said, I think, say, comparing two county sheriff's offices is probably more of a like comparison than, say, comparing a sheriff's office and a police department. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about the data we have here in Sonoma County, now that we've started gathering it just in the last year, is that while we only have 6 months worth of data in this first report, from my perspective, for the sheriff's office, it's really about 3 different operations that they have going. So first, they have data in the RIPA report regarding the sheriff's office generally at the patrol level. So that would be operations all over the county in unincorporated areas. Separately, there's another section in the RIPA report that talks about the city of Sonoma, which, as you know, is a contract agency run by the sheriff's office. But that data is just about the stops in that community. And so the nature of the enforcement activities in that community are going to be somewhat different than what you see in the county as a whole, for a variety of reasons. But I think one that stands out to my mind is that, as I understand it, I've been told that the sheriff's personnel that work for the city of Sonoma would do some traffic enforcement. But as a general rule, sheriff's deputies who are in the unincorporated parts of the county usually do not do traffic enforcement. And there probably, if we're able to eventually get more detailed data, there probably are some other significant differences in the work that's done in those two different places based on the nature of the assignment. I don't think we know yet whether or not any of that data causes us, or any of those different assignments or job functions causes us to view the data differently. But I do think it's important for us to be mindful as we consider the data that the information about the sheriff's office generally, we probably should look at separately, at least in my opinion, from town of Sonoma or town of Windsor, since those are both contract departments and have some slightly different functions. I did appreciate that all three of those are called out separately in the RIPA data, so one can look at those separately in the RIPA data, and I think that's beneficial. Another thing that I would say is, I think important for us to think about is what kinds of stops are reported and what kinds of stops are not reported. So we do talk a lot about traffic stops. Those are going to be reported to the extent that there are any. If a sheriff's deputy or a sheriff's deputy serving in one of the contract cities gets a call for service from the public and then responds to that call and detains someone there, that detention or stop would also be included in this data. Any kind of probation or parole search would also be included in the data. Intriguingly, though, people who are detained because there's a search warrant for them are not listed.
A search warrant or an arrest warrant?
Either one, as far as I understand it. So I'm not exactly sure why the RIPA legislation chose to do it that way, but that's part of the information that's not reported. Now, I suppose one of the things that's important to think about there is with search warrants and arrest warrants, there's actually a judge ordering officers or deputy sheriffs to take that action. So because that material is not reported in the stop data, it takes out a set of cases where somebody other than a police officer has told the police officer to go make the stop. As a general rule, in all of the other categories we do see reported, there's at least some level of discretion that the law enforcement officer is using. And I think that's important because that tells us the RIPA data is measuring how officers exercise their discretion, at least to some extent. Now, I think it is fair to say when deputies or police officers are called to respond to service in the community, there's a little less discretion there. Someone in the community's asked them to show up and maybe reporting to them, hey, that person over there is the person who needs your attention, allegedly committed a crime or the like. With traffic stops, you'll see a much greater degree of law enforcement discretion. And I think many observers in this field suggest that the likelihood of bias creeping into decision-making is greater the larger the discretion is that the officer has. So from my perspective, I think as we eventually get more detailed data from the sheriff's office, it would be useful to think about what kinds of activities these deputies are involved in and which ones have more discretion and which ones have less. I think that might be an important factor in assessing whether this data shows us bias or doesn't show us bias. Another thing that has been discussed in public a fair bit is how do we know the racial or gender identity of the person who was stopped? And I think it is important to understand that the way the RIPA legislation is written, law enforcement officials are supposed to be recording what they perceive the gender, race, and other characteristics of the person stopped are. That has pros and cons. I mean, one, I suppose a con would be we don't know for sure how that person would choose to be identified. The person who is detained doesn't have a voice in asserting how they would like to be identified in this data. So in that regard, it could be that the detained person might choose to identify differently, and if we knew that information, the data might look a little different. On the other hand, we do know that the data is measuring the officer's subjective impression. So if we're trying to look for whether an officer has bias or is exerting some kind of bias in the course of their work, their subjective impression about race or gender or other characteristics of the people they're stopping is probably the better measure of whether there is some bias involved or not involved. But I think it is important to remember that there will be at least some potential for disconnect between the officer's perception and the actual identification that that person might adopt. I think that's particularly complicated in our society where people might view themselves as having multiple backgrounds. You know, if they identify as multiracial, for example, or they identify as non-binary, right? Those might not be well captured in data. Another thing that is supposed to be captured in the data is English fluency. Now, again, this is very subjective, and I don't know that there's a very good measuring stick for this, but that is another factor that we can look to in the data. Whether there is some kind of a disability at play is another factor, but again, we don't really know if the officer is correctly or incorrectly identifying that. We're just getting the officer's perception, which is still important. And to some extent, we get some information back about what the result of the detention is. Was some contraband found or not? So you'll see in the RIPA data that we do see some results back about how often searches would yield actual proof of a crime, root of a crime. And I think that's very useful too. There's been, I think, a lot of discussion among many agencies about how you would compare accurately the frequency with which people of any given background are stopped as against the local population. So, for example, you could take a very large sample and say in all of Sonoma County, right? We have some idea from census data of what we think the different distribution of each racial group is in Sonoma County, and we can compare that against stop data for the whole county and see how those compare to see if there's a significant disconnect. That said, I think there are some arguments to be made about why those numbers might not be the best, and that could go either way. And I don't know that that necessarily supports or necessarily undercuts arguments that this data shows bias, but I think it's important to be mindful that in the operations that deputy sheriffs are engaged in, any one of these kinds of enforcement activities might end up bringing them into contact with a really different set of people, depending. So, for example, I would not expect that for the City of Windsor Police Department, it would be fair to compare their stop data against the population for the county as a whole, right? We might want to look more specifically at Windsor. Even then, if we were looking at traffic stop data, a legitimate argument that I think a lot of people have brought up is it's hard to know who really is driving in any community. It might not always be a valid assumption that the people driving in the community exactly match the demographic breakdown that you would see in the census for that census tract. And I think we just don't know if that cuts one way or the other. You know, that said, I think there's really no question that in all these categories, we do see a disproportionate rate of stops for Black people and also for Latinos throughout all the data. And by a really dramatic percentage, such that it's hard to, we don't have really great data for analyzing further in the way that I just described, but it's hard to imagine that things like who is driving versus who lives in the community by itself could possibly account for the numbers that we're seeing. I have in the past been mindful that in some of these categories of enforcement, there are good arguments that we as a culture have chosen to create policies at the state level that are going to by themselves have disproportionate impact on people of color. So, for example, when I was a district attorney in the 1990s, there was a great emphasis in the state on criminalizing driving on a suspended license or not having insurance for one's car. I think 25 years later, 26 years later, we now understand that it is the case that people who have suspended licenses and don't have insurance for their car disproportionately are people who have less money. It's harder to maintain those two things when you have less money. And we all know that wealth is not distributed particularly fairly in our society by race. So if we criminalize driving on a suspended license and we criminalize not having valid registration for the car and we criminalize not having insurance, almost necessarily we can expect that the people who will be stopped or detained and ultimately cited are going to be disproportionately people of color because of the income inequality in our society. So those are complicated issues to think about too. I don't think that necessarily explains other issues like the rate of return on searches or how frequently people are asked for permission to search, or arrest rates or detention rates that don't result in arrest. So this is all to say it's a really complicated subject and there's a lot we just don't know, especially because we only have a limited amount of data so far for Sonoma County. So with that in mind, I think I would suggest as we think about how to move forward on this as a CAC, that we consider what kinds of activities are the ones where we are most concerned about bias creeping in. In my opinion, those are probably the ones where law enforcement officials have the most discretion and are asked to take proactive action without someone else prompting them. And those are the places where we're probably most likely to see the danger of bias creeping in. And those are the places where more data might help us to better answer some of these questions. I think that could be a fairly long project. And it might include, say, over the next few months, figuring out what other data we think the sheriff's office might best collect or how they might analyze it in a way that's different from what we've done in the past. And there are some other communities that have been dealing with this data longer than we have here in Sonoma County, and they might have some insights for us. So I think there's a lot of directions one could go. I hope those insights are helpful.
Thank you, John. Any questions from Stephen?
Oh, I'll go on with it, I'm always out on. The executive summary, including all the data we got, was the 2023 report. Just make it easy. Males make up less than 50% of the population, and males were 72% of the people pulled over. So you can either say all the police are biased and prejudiced against men, or you can say most instances driving and men drive more aggressively, changing lanes and doing stuff. And if you look at pictures of sideshows, almost always it's a male driving a car. So I think just to take male or black or any other number by itself, you're just kind of not wasting time. Your own bias is going to trip in. The police are biased against X and you find it. The other thing, I thought we were going to bring this up last time. I looked at 6 articles in the Press Democrat that day. Of the 6, 5 of the arrests that led to major drug and other things were people either from Santa Barbara or out of, not even in the county, much less in the area where they pulled over. So trying to compare numbers to the population, I think you're dead. You almost have to compare the numbers to how many people live in the county that are pulled over and ignore the people that don't if you're trying to make any kind of analysis. And then what was the event? And if more men drive bad than women, maybe
That's
agree.
definitely the truth.
I would agree.
The insurance companies.
You know that.
There's 75% of men use bias. So again, I'm not on.
The out of towners, why does that matter? I mean, if
Well, if you're comparing the population,
well,
if you're trying to say Sonoma County has X%,
okay, so
but
let's
if
like,
you look at a sideshow of the number of people you pull over and they're from other areas.
but if there's a higher proportion of minorities pulled over by police and they're all from outside of Sonoma County, that's still evidence of bias, right?
I don't think so.
Oh, I
That's
think
what they
so.
did.
Well, I mean, like, let's go back to the sunset towns in the south, right? Where, you know, you roll into a town and if you're there after dark and you are a minority, you are essentially going to be almost guaranteed of being
Yes.
detained. So I think it's really important, you know, I get what you're saying in terms of comparing the demographics, but it's still good data to know what the percentages are of those people. And it's perceived race that's important to me.
But I mean,
Far more important than who they identify as. So I get your point, like if you're just trying to compare demographics, but if we had like an officer who is consistently pulling over minorities regardless if that person is from Sonoma County or some other town or county, that's good data for us to know as a community.
Yeah.
That's evidence to me of bias. So I think we would want to know that.
Does the officer know the person driving before they pull it over? You see someone driving down the road, you come behind them and pull them over. You have no idea who they are.
You know, one thing I should point out here is that the RIPA data does not answer the question for us of whether the officer knew the identity of the person detained before they made the detention or not. It just doesn't tell us one way or the other. Now, I suppose one could make an argument that the data might be more useful if it did tell us that, but it's not designed to capture that. It just doesn't capture that information. It's just, for lack of a better term, it's a black box. We just don't know.
Also, or you describe the officer might be important. You know, is a white officer doing something for a black officer doing something?
I don't know if that matters. I mean, I think, I like your point though. I like your point about the single point of data. I mean, I think any data set, if you look at it and you just pick one data point and say, and try and put your entire argument on that, that's gonna fail. I mean, so to me, what's interesting about this data is we can match it with other pieces of data, right? So say we have officers who are pulling over minorities at a higher rate. And then we say, okay, well, what percentage of those interactions were escalated? And then if we can start pairing things together, like, oh, wow, there's a much higher escalation rate when there's a minority being pulled over or detained, that becomes part of this context, right? And it paints a picture over time that becomes very instructive for the community and the management of the sheriff's office, I imagine, as well.
Looking also to what area does the officer patrol?
Sure.
So someone in certain areas get different racial outputs than people in other areas. I just think the data is so new and so poor right now.
You know, that raises an interesting question to my mind too, which is, from what I have seen, I'm not aware that the data we have from the sheriff's office has been presented, at least from what I've seen, in a way that would let us know where the sheriff's office stops were happening, like what part of the county. So for example, there are zones that the county's broken into for patrol purposes. And I do think location is taken in the data when the deputies enter it into the system, but I haven't seen that then sorted so that we can understand how these stops vary from zone to zone. And, you know, they might be different in South County than in West County or than in the Valley of Sonoma. I just don't know, but I think that data would be available if we could work with the sheriff's office to have them crunch it a little further. And that might tell us more.
Yeah, and just because a data set isn't perfect, doesn't mean it's not useful. I mean, no data set is perfect. If you ever work with government data, it's constant, there's tons of errors within it, but you can still pull out lessons from it and you aggregate that data with other data sources and it becomes very, very useful. So I'd hesitate to just label it as like incomplete and therefore, invalid or something. And I know we had people in the DA's office, I think the DA herself and people in the sheriff's office who were making that argument, basically, oh, it didn't do X, therefore it is invalid. I think we need to push back on that a little bit. And I hope they have walked back those comments, although I haven't heard whether or not that's the case.
I think I just want to jump in because there seems to be a concentration just on, at least some of the comments suggest concentration just on individual law enforcement officers. I think that this is not just a question of whether individual officers are behaving like this. It's a whole systemic culture. And so, in terms of what the demographics of the place where the stops are occurring is, well, why are there so many cops in that particular place? I mean, you look at Hunter's Point and you'll see, a gajillion more cops, and they're stopping everybody multiple times a day if they know that they've got a probation or a parole violation. So that neighborhood is going to be all black, but you're going to see just a huge number of stops that are done just frankly for harassment purposes. And that's not necessarily just one cop, that's a whole culture of that department. So I think we have to not focus on that, don't over atomize the information.
I call Petaluma did a DUI stop. They tried to see if they kept data. And they did so many cars through. Did you keep data who's driving those cars and composition? Because if you know there's 100 people on the road and of those 75 are male and you're arresting 75 male, that kind of all makes sense. If there's 25 male and 75 women, you're only addressing male. But they don't keep any of those records. I agree. I agree. I think that's goes on a lot.
Well, I might add to follow up on what you're both saying, that the information that sheriff's deputies record for each of these data points includes the time, the date, and the location of the contact. So I would imagine that then the data at least exists for us to answer some of these questions, like what was the collection of stops at a DUI checkpoint on a given day, right? Or what was, the overall stop data for the Guerneville substation for the month of May. Now, I've not had someone at the sheriff's office tell me that's specifically available, but when I look at the data that's entered, it seems to me the data is there. It's been entered into the system. And if we need to have some conversation about ways to pull out more detailed data in ways we find helpful, I think that would have a lot of value, especially in the first year or two of the system. So we're trying to figure out even just what the baseline is, like what's going on this year, how it's compared to next year and the year after.
Any other questions, Tom?
More than enough.
Okay, and just to add here, it looks like when the form gets completed and you want to search a location, or the location enter should be nearby or closest intersection. So if you ever wanted to look at something specific, it looks like there is a way to search it based on how the data is entered by the deputy. Ellen, any questions?
Thank you.
Marcy?
A lot, kind of frustrating, but it's like, the thing, it was very helpful. If even, I don't know if you all noticed, but like at the end of the month, I feel like the cops are everywhere, right? They're patrolling, and so just like the time and date too, like that would be really interesting to know. And even though it's been told time and time again, there's no quota, all of that, but it's just very, interesting, if we can extract whatever we're looking for and what the reason to that is, so.
I think that's it. I look forward to the presentation, hopefully next time, or I don't know.
Well, I think, it would be, in my opinion, useful for us tonight to see who's interested in being on the ad hoc about this topic. And perhaps having that group try for a first meeting between now and our next CAC meeting, so we can figure out some more specific angles to investigate in this data, because it's just so huge that one could go in any number of directions. I think figuring out what we think the community might be interested in, us drilling down on, would be a really good use of time.
Thank you. So seeing there are no additional questions, we'll open it up for public comment. So if anyone from the public wishes to address the council on this presentation, you could just step in the middle of the room. And it does capture, if you just stand there, we type it in.
And it was weird walking to the.
Yeah.
You ever anything? I feel like I'm being put in detention or something.
I'll have to record stop data.
So I'm really glad that the data is here. I'm really disappointed that the sheriff's office really bungled getting someone to present to us. And I think that's really poor form on their part, because this is an important organization and should be treated as such. And that doesn't make me feel like we're getting a lot of love here. So that was really disappointing. In terms of the data itself, it's 6 months worth, and I think it's great that we have it. But I kind of view it kind of like a blood test, you get them over time, and it's more the trend. It's like the IOLERO reports. It's like in every single one, there's a complete investigation. Well, we've got a problem, that we need to really improve. And so that's kind of where I'm seeing it. And so I think all those issues around the data will work out themselves if we see a better trend going forward as you guys work on this with the sheriff's office. Thanks again.
Thank you.
I'm the part, this is weird. Or actually, when the crowd's this small, we should just pull the tables around and have us all sit here and make us honorary CAC members for the evening. Because it would be a lot better and more productive. So the RIPA data and traffic stops, I appreciate the discussion and the debate about the data. I'm not a fan of data for the simple reason that if we keep our eye on the bigger prize here, as Councilman Pemberton pointed out, don't get buried in the weeds of the data. The ultimate goal here is to eliminate traffic stops. That's it. There's no further discussion behind that. Traffic stops, the data is all applicable. And yes, there is definitely racial disparities behind it. I think for law enforcement in this county to a knee-jerk refuting the data is a disservice to all of us. It needs to stop. And you know, Director Alden talked about discretion with traffic stops and searches of cars. That discretion is really powerful. And knowing how traffic stops work, pretext or otherwise, even legitimate traffic stops, the discretion is really powerful because for every traffic stop that I made where I gave somebody a ticket, I let 2 people go. I got to make that decision. So that one person that gets a ticket now has to go through the whole process. And not only that, we've just gummed up the works of this bureaucracy by inserting this ticket into the system. Now there's a whole court date and this person knows it's time. And the 2 people that got to go, they're happy. They spread the word on the cop, everything's good. We need to stop traffic stops because we're seeing bad outcomes. We know that they're being used to generate revenue. They are very discriminatory, whether it's bias for race or class or gender. Cops, maybe not intentionally, and what their perception is, they're still doing it. And I totally agree with you on the issue of it doesn't really matter whether that person of color came from Sonoma County or San Mateo County. We still got stopped in Sonoma County. And the encounter happened there. So the data is important, but the bigger issues we got to stop the traffic stops. And that's what we got to keep the pressure on the sheriff's office and law enforcement in this area and nationwide to stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, do we have anyone on Zoom in hand raised? Okay. Nancy will start the timer once they begin speaking. Brian, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I just want to explain that this is kind of an unacceptable situation, so just to prepare you for what I'm going to say. In 2017, I was put in a carotid hold, nearly killed and seriously injured by a knee to my back in a technique that caused great bodily injury, not just to me, but to various other people as well, such as Danny Banks, who suffered internal bleeding from a knee to the back 2 years prior to the incident with me, and David Ward, who died from the carotid hold 2.5 years after the incident with me. After I informed everyone, including Mark Essick, who was then captain of Internal Affairs, IOLERO, Andrew Cash, who was then a sergeant, Eddie Engram, who was a captain in 2018, Linda Hopkins, and various others, that the carotid hold is a lethal technique that was used recklessly and dangerously by the sheriff's office. Those were literally my exact words in writing to IOLERO and Ms. Hopkins, and in the recorded interview with Andrew Cash, Internal Affairs, who laughed. Since then, the county has stolen 6 years of my life, misusing public funds to withhold even a minimum of compensation, lying about conducting an investigation, literally getting caught destroying camera records for a well-established practice and custom, which also occurred in the 2015 torture ring / yard counseling case where Cecile Foca and others lied about the existence of videos and destroyed the video where they gave Danny Banks internal bleeding, and the 2019 Nino Busco case where the court instructed the jury to assume that the evidence had been destroyed with intent. The county has criminally withheld evidence and openly violated various other laws as well as rules of civil procedure and implicated the court in misconduct. Nobody responds to my emails or voicemails or answers the phone. Nobody responds to my requests for public records. IOLERO doesn't seem to have ever done anything in any of the cases of misconduct except be a heat sink for the ongoing public dissatisfaction with continued murders and terrorism, and does not enact any justice. There were no records made of any of the misconduct that occurred. No changes are made by the sheriff's office until innocent people die on camera after they were warned that the techniques they use recklessly are well known to be lethal and get repeatedly caught lying and destroying evidence. The incident occurred under a camera and in front of witnesses, including the commanding officer. The garage hold was illegal per post basic statewide police standards for 2017 unless the subject exhibited assaultive behavior. Even according to the two officers who admit to assaulting me, my behavior did not rise to that level, meaning the garage hold was irrefutably illegal. According to the commanding officer, Lieutenant Melissa Parmenter, I was not resisting. According to the third-party witnesses, including the bystander witness who saw the entire incident and Officer Robert Sagan of Roanoke Park Police, I need
Thank you for
30
your
more
comment.
seconds, please.
I think we have one more speaker in the queue.
Thank you, Greg. Sure. Okay, Jerry.
Good evening. Good evening. My name is Jerry Treat. Thanks for this very interesting discussion, and John for kind of laying out the different issues around the use of this data very compellingly. I'm a data nerd, so I really love this discussion. I look forward to it continuing over a long period of time. You're going to have these reports coming to you regularly. It's going to provide you a lot of great information. And I just wanted to make a couple of suggestions. There's a really excellent report that came out of the Chicago Office of Inspector General, looking at data like this in the city of Chicago over a period of time. It was released in March of 2022, and it really explores some of these issues about what data is necessary to make meaning out of this, and the different stages at which discretion enters the equation and can influence the outcomes on the level of the demographics of the suspects. The other thing I would suggest to you is that this kind of data can be really useful if presented in a way that is readily accessible to the public and easily manipulable on a public dashboard. And there are increasingly a number of public entities like cities and counties, police departments and sheriff's departments who are putting these on their websites so that the public can go in and manipulate the data any way they choose and look at the data the way they want to look at it. So I would suggest that this body explore that option and talk with the sheriff about it. I think that would be a really useful thing for the public. Thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you, Jerry. Do you have any other hands raised? So we only do 1 3-minute opportunity per item. So we'll go ahead and close public comment if there are no additional hands raised. And we'll bring it back to council for any final points of discussion. Anything? Okay. So I think the ad hoc idea will be discussed that when we get to item D. So we'll go ahead and close item A and then move down to item C, which is a work plan from the CAC retreat. And John, did you want to give?
Sure. I wanted to make sure to get this written version of what I believe we agreed to at the end of our retreat back to all of you, so you can take a look at it. There wasn't enough time between our retreat and the last meeting to turn around to, obviously, but I have it on not so much for action, but just to see if there is anything the CAC members think might be missing or incorrect in this work plan, so we can all edit it accordingly before we start executing on it.
So we'll start with questions. There, hopefully everyone had an opportunity to look at it. It's page 68 in the packet. Tom, any questions? Evan?
No questions.
Marcy? Nathan? Okay, so we'll open it up for public comment. If anyone in the audience has any comments on the report for the work plan retreat summary that was provided, let us know by addressing the council. Okay, we see no one from the audience. Do you have any hands raised? Okay, so the public comment, if it's on the work plan, we'll take the 3 minutes, otherwise we'll have to end the comment if it's unrelated to this item. So Brian, we'll go ahead and start your time once you begin speaking, but please make sure that your comment is specific to this item on the agenda only. Otherwise, you can finish your comments from earlier when we get to item 9 on the agenda, which is the open time for public comment.
I'll wait until item 9 then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Okay, so we'll go ahead and close public comment and bring it back to council for final points of discussion. Evan,
No, nothing for
Marcy.
So I'm assuming that this now is the work plan that we're gonna be operating. That this is what we agreed to in February, okay. And that this is where our priorities will be.
Yes.
And we'll adjust the calendar as necessary to accommodate the sheriff liaison.
Nathan.
Yeah, no comments, no?
So I actually was thinking that we should take a formal vote on accepting the summary, because we did our first retreat. I think we should have like something official showing that we're, we're declaring what was discussed, and that kind of like unofficial like minutes for the retreat that took place, and we have an actual adopted sort of work plan to move forward on. And I think, in my opinion, that we should take formal action on it by doing a vote. So if you all agree, if I can have a motion to approve the work plan.
So I'll make a motion to approve the work plan from the CAC 2023 retreat as our, I guess, as our map and as our guide for the upcoming.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We have no abstentions and no nays, so the item passes and it's officially adopted. Thank you.
Great.
So we'll move on to.
Before we move on, can we just confirm, are we gonna do a retreat every year? Or is that the plan?
I think,
Annual retreat, kind of?
I think as often as the CAC wants to do it, but I think, annual is not too frequent. And, but not too far apart.
Yeah, I think that, I think doing that annually is actually a great idea. It was really good, I think, for the CAC, especially after COVID, not seeing everybody for so long. But also members of our community. It was really nice to have the sheriff and Chris Dorsey out there. I think yearly that would be something great. If for nothing else, then to remind the sheriff and the board of supervisors that we're here and what we're doing.
Yep.
yeah,
Yeah, I thought it was great. I mean, I really
Yeah.
thought it was great. And I think during the retreat, I think I might have whispered to you, we should do this every 6 months. Because I felt like it was so productive. I know that's hard to do with schedules and stuff, and obviously we wouldn't need to do it every 6 months for planning purposes if we're doing annual planning stuff, but I thought it was really productive, and I thought the interactions with the community were great. And so I would encourage us to do it as frequently as possible.
I might add that if the members of the CAC and the community enjoyed just the opportunity to engage in a less structured way. Certainly one can do that in a way that's consistent with the Brown Act. We could have a meeting or a special event that's just a reception and a chat, and the agenda could be small group conversation. As long as you don't, take any action that isn't noticed, on the agenda, and you're just having some conversation, then that can certainly be done. So if that's useful, that maybe that's useful to do more often. That's here.
yes, thank you. And I think it's also helpful the way that you write it, the way that the information is summarized and how you capture everything that's done during the retreat. So I really appreciate all the staff work on this.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we'll move on to item D, new ad hoc committees. So as kind of mentioned earlier from John and what was discussed in the retreat, we had an idea of having an ad hoc on stops and data and RIPA data, and then also on recruitment and culture change. Sorry, I can't speak. Which we'll be hearing about next month. So we put this on the agenda in case you all wanted to sign up for the ad hoc on data and RIPA data. Or we can postpone it for if you still wanna, wait to see what gets brought up after we have the presentation on recruitment and culture change, then we can do a formal vote and ad hoc assignments at the next meeting, depending on what you all decide. But if you've already made up your mind, we can go ahead and put out names as to who might want to be on the ad hoc for stop data right now.
Are we planning, are we planning to have a presentation on stop data still, or is that kind of shelved until sometime in the future?
I think that's up to the CAC. I think my advice to you all would be, at least have your ad hoc think about something more targeted than just talking about stop data for your next presentation. And then perhaps have another presentation here once you figure out what that more targeted approach is. But of course, it's entirely up to you if you go another direction.
I just wanted to follow up on, actually looking at the materials that that were produced. I'm not sure how helpful that presentation, which seems to be addressed to how do you go about keeping, how does a deputy out in the field track the information, is necessarily the most helpful presentation. And it sort of actually led me to think about how we might better focus presentations from the sheriff's department, rather than just asking them to make a presentation, ask them to make a presentation addressing X, Y, and Z. So.
I want a presentation when we've asked questions.
Yeah.
Really.
Right. Well, and that may be just to say that you want somebody who knows this stuff, so we can ask the question. That we're not asking for a presentation. We're asking for somebody to come and answer our questions.
Like that.
That.
And there's no reason to delay the forming of the ad hoc, I don't think. I mean, I think we do that tonight, right? I mean, although there are people missing, so, Max isn't here. So I'm not sure how to, I mean, I guess people can volunteer.
Clear, the ad hoc is limited to 4 people, is that correct? From the CAC, plus we have others.
Well, from a Brown Act perspective, you shouldn't have a majority of the CAC
Right.
members.
So right now, less than 4.
Has to be like.
Right now, 3, because right now, correct, right now there's only 7 members, so 3 or less for that ad hoc.
Until we get to 9, we would need 9 people on the. Here to have more than 3.
Right, yeah.
So to Nathan's point, if we have people who already know that they want to be on this ad hoc, you want to sign up now, we can go ahead and make those appointments, I guess. Okay.
It's interesting. Okay, that's one.
In case I wasn't already on.
I was gonna say, well, we have 7 people here, who all want to be on this ad hoc.
I'll offer, I'd love to be biased, and I think you gotta understand, more men drive like idiots, so the fact that men get pulled over is not bias or anything else. And you could go into certain communities and find certain activities that might have. So I'm kind of biased that we need more information. So I'd love to be on the committee, but there's 3 people that really want to be on it. I'll stay.
I'm glad, Tom, that you can acknowledge your anti-male bias.
Yeah.
What if 60% of those males were Black and the other 40
I know.
were brown colored?
Yeah.
I don't think
Yeah.
male versus female is necessarily the biggest breakdown. When this breaks down into racial disparity as well, I think once you break it down, I think once you get down into the numbers, there could be a lot of bias there, whether it be gender bias, racial bias, or location bias. I think an examination of the data can show a lot.
Yeah, and I think, to get back to your point, Tom, I think it would behoove us to think about multiple causes for the disparate impacts, right? It might be officer bias, and we need to always be looking at that. It could also be policy design or enforcement decisions. We're going to enforce a particular traffic rule in this community because we've been getting a lot of complaints from this community, and then that creates a disparate impact because of who's in that community. So to Evan's point, I think it's good that we are still looking closely at these disparities and trying to figure out why they're there.
Like if they enforce the HRV lanes, a lot of Tesla drivers.
I think before more people volunteer for this ad hoc, we'll take public comment first. Is there anyone from the public that wants to comment on this item? No one in the room?
Oh, wait, can I just ask a question? How are you guys gonna decide community members for your ad hocs? How does that process work?
I'll mention.
That's a great question.
So Nancy and I, and we checked with John, we were thinking of having individuals from the CAC volunteer to be on the ad hoc. And then once the ad hoc has more of an idea on the direction that they're gonna go into, then we'll open it up for the community or announce that any community members interested in assisting the ad hoc on whatever route they're gonna go towards to reach out to the ad hoc like chair or members directly. So right now we won't be taking volunteers from the public. And if there are if we could just do it through the public comment process. Good news. Is it gonna be that?
No, I'm not gonna be 3
Okay,
minutes.
go ahead.
But what if we want to help define that direction for the ad hoc,
Email us.
you know, okay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I should not.
No, that's perfect. That's.
Now the CAC.
So,
Yes, I know.
Yeah, I mean, the public knows what direction we're going in, on what subject matter for the ad hoc, so ideas are definitely always welcome. So, send us anything you got, including information or sources like the Chicago Office of the Inspector General report that Jerry Threet mentioned, and things like that will definitely be helpful. Okay, so we'll bring it back to the council, and we decided we were going to sign up, so we have Nathan. I'm also interested on that ad hoc. Anyone else? This will be for stop data or RIPA. And we can always bring it back to get additional members at the next meeting.
I'd like to.
Okay, so for now we have 3 individuals. Okay, so that is that item. Now we'll move on to the director's report.
That's the only ad hoc we're doing tonight. We'll do the other one. We'll do the other one next week.
Or did you want to do them? Do you want to wait?
For the recruitment and culture change, can we possibly form the ad hoc for that after we hear more about them?
Yes.
Yes, I do expect you'll have a pretty robust presentation at the next CAC meeting about hiring and recruiting and selection and how that process shapes who's working for the sheriff's office. And I think there are many other issues about culture, but I think that's a good jumping off point.
Yeah, that seems like a good point to form a new ad hoc on that. Okay, great. Thank you.
And before I forget, and John might ask you to help me on this. So at the retreat, we talked about making the community engagement ad hoc a standing committee because it's ongoing. And did we need to again decide? I think we do need to, right? Decide who's gonna stay on the ad hoc committee. Would we do that at this time
I
or?
think you could. I mean, you're
since it's already
changing that
established.
ad hoc and making it into a standing committee. And that was one of the things mentioned in the work plan also from the retreat. So I think a place to start might be who would like to be on it.
Yeah.
Which one?
Community engagement, which right now is Marcy and Tom. So it's staying on as in, oh, no longer Tom?
I just didn't get on. I don't think,
So
I don't
at
think
this-
I'm adding value by being on it, so I just.
so at this time, we have the community engagement ad hoc committee, which is, we just approved to be a standing committee via the work plan that we just adopted. And so you are currently the only individual on it, and we're opening it up to members of the CAC to see if anyone would want to join you in this, in the work that you're doing. And to also verify that you want to stay on.
Oh, that was not.
Evan,
I'll join the community engagement ad hoc.
Standing.
Standing.
Yeah,
Do you need
so,
to join a standing committee or just anyone, since it has to be run as a public meeting, right?
Right
So
now,
then-
we're getting most of, like, everything from Lisa,
Okay,
from information and getting. That either comes through IOLERO or she knows of them, so I feel like a lot of that's being done already with communicating.
From a Brown Act perspective, we will need to have some conversation among the members of that committee about when they plan to meet. And we'll need to, and that could be any frequency, could be quarterly or whatever you find works for you. And then make sure that that regular meeting schedule is known and that we have a place for that to happen.
thank you.
I'd like to serve on that too. I'd like to do that.
Awesome, and I don't know if this is where you were going with it, but because it's a standing committee, I mean, because it's going to be agendized and open to the public, if more individuals decided to attend, is that allowed?
It would still have to not have a majority of the full CAC. So you still have the 3-member limit for now until we get more members on board, and then go up to 4.
Okay, awesome, and it sounds like we have 3 members, so that covers.
I just don't.
Oh, okay, great.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're done with that item now, so we'll go to item 7.
Great. For the director's report, this evening, I had a couple brief announcements and then a brief discussion about the most recent PERB decision. I'll start with the PERB decision. So in the agenda packet, we have the decision from the Public Employment Relations Board about Measure P. This is the most recent decision, which came out February 28th, 2023, which is too close in time to our last meeting for it to be agendized. So I wanted to put this on not to talk about all of the details of this decision, because for labor lawyers who are so interested, one could read this for quite a while and have a lot of thoughts about, say, the Claremont test and its pros and cons. What I think is actually really important for this group is to understand where that litigation has landed. So as you'll recall, we had Measure P, which the Board of Supervisors ultimately put on the ballot as opposed to the voters at the end of the day. Approved by the voters, and then some months later, a challenge brought by multiple employer unions in Sonoma County. Ultimately, there was one lead association initially, but then they had multiple associations eventually bring this challenge at PERB, saying there should have been a meet and confer process before this measure went onto the ballot. And there are many questions that this litigation has addressed. And I think there are 2 that are particularly important for us to understand here. One is, does there have to be a conversation between the employer, the county, and the various employee unions that are involved when one makes changes to things like disciplinary systems or ways that you create policy? And then the other is, does that have to happen before or after you put that issue on the ballot? So we ended up first being at PERB, then the county appealed the initial ruling from PERB. We got a decision from an appellate court here in California last summer, which basically sent us back to PERB for PERB to redo its original decision. Now PERB has redone its original decision. And I think the bottom line here on both of those questions is, yes, many of the topics in Measure P, and if we're ever to have a measure on in the future, they're related to IOLERO, generally speaking, most of those are probably going to require a meet and confer process before the matter goes onto the ballot. At least if you do it through that same route, having the Board of Supervisors put it on the ballot. The second conclusion that PERB has reached here is, in addition to that, having to have that conversation, it also has to happen before we put it on the ballot. So we have answers to 2 questions. Yes, these are topics that do require the meet and confer process. And yes, it has to happen before the item goes on the ballot. Now, from there, I think the really important result that we got out of this PERB decision is, while their analysis has several steps that are kind of hard to follow, the end of the analysis on this last issue is, hey, look, because the County of Sonoma has already met and conferred with the applicable unions as of now, early 2023, this issue is no longer one to litigate at PERB. The end result is because we went into a meet and confer process with the unions at the same time the litigation was going, and because that resolved with some letters of agreement about how to implement Measure P, PERB says there's really nothing left for PERB to do at this point. So I think a fair, thumbnail sketch would be, at least as it went at PERB, like we lost on both of the issues that we were litigating there, but we won on the ultimate strategy, which was get a negotiated agreement with the unions and implement that. So because of the letters of agreement from last year, we are today able to keep going forward on Measure P. In that regard, this decision doesn't change anything that we're doing right now. So there's no change in the next 6 months or a year or 2 years even about how we implement Measure P. And in that regard, it is useful that we had those conversations with the unions, regardless of whether one likes the letters or doesn't. The fact that we did it gets us to a place where we're no longer in front of PERB. If we hadn't done that, for better or for worse, we would still be in litigation at PERB because PERB would have then, in this decision, prohibited us from implementing many of the provisions of Measure P. So pros and cons. The end result is we're moving forward on Measure P, and I think that's good news. So I like that part of the result, even if there are other details here that I'm maybe not as excited about. So I hope that's helpful. The end result there is we're status quo. We're moving forward on Measure P, but I wanted to keep you informed about what happened.
What I don't understand is your last statement.
Yeah.
And that is, I thought the appellate court said you can't make these, you can't take take provisions that were voted on by the voters and deem them unenforceable. You don't have that power, PERB.
This gets into a technical detail that I didn't address in the rest of my report.
Because
But yeah, it basically,
on technical.
that's okay. I know you're a lawyer and I'm a recovering lawyer. So I can sympathize. But I think a fair short summary would be as follows. PERB in its first decision just outright struck down parts of Measure P. So these are illegal and just erased them from the books. The appellate court said, PERB, you can't actually do that. You can prevent the county of Sonoma from implementing those provisions, from starting work on them, but you can't strike them down and delete them off the books. And there's another process for that that's much more complicated that the appellate court said PERB would have to follow. And there's at least one other case from some years ago that says the same thing. So that's at least consistent with the past, which is the appellate court's telling PERB, look, you can't delete or undo a ballot measure, but you can prohibit an employer from actually implementing it and moving forward on it. That ended up not being an issue. We had to keep litigating with PERB because we ended up having some negotiations and reached an agreement. And so one way that this issue probably will not come up again for us in Sonoma County is that we now have an agreement, so we don't have to keep litigating. But it is, for lawyers, it's an interesting question. Can PERB actually strike down a statute and delete it, or can they just block an employer from implementing it? For me, in my work, right, I'm just happy we can implement Measure P. So like for me, the result is the same. But I'm sure there'll be some labor lawyers who'll be litigating that issue in other ways in the future. So.
What's to stop? I mean, I guess I'm a little confused as far as how the ballot measure gets played into this. I mean, so what's to stop PERB from stepping in, or the unions just every time we make any suggestion of change that might impact a single employee? What's to stop them from going to PERB and saying they're doing it wrong, or can you make them stop,
Well, I think one of the takeaways here is that if we're talking about ballot measures specifically.
And is that the context of this decision? Is it's only that?
Well, everything we've been talking about here is in the context of Measure P. So they've really been talking about everything in Measure P, and that's a
Right.
ballot measure, right?
Yeah.
There is a broader principle at play, which is when can an employer, meaning the county, change conditions of employment for sheriff's deputies and other employees of the sheriff's office? And at the end of the day, the answer to both of those questions is, well, whether it's by ballot measure or some other way, if it affects the working conditions of the employee, then there has to be a meet and confer process first. Now, there's some very technical, and my perspective, overly complicated rules that are discussed in all three of these decisions about how you figure out what issues are and are not required to go through the meet and confer process. I think for our purposes, if anyone in Sonoma County ever wanted to do a ballot measure about Measure P or IOLERO in the future, we almost certainly would need to get some good legal advice about what portions trigger meet and confer. Assume that almost anything we change about IOLERO and Measure P probably is going to trigger meet and confer. Start with that assumption until you get some really solid advice otherwise. And make sure that meet and confer process happens before the Board of Supervisors puts a ballot measure on. If we set aside this litigation for a minute and look at the broader universe of labor law, I think there is a very strong argument to be made that a ballot measure put together by voters and put on the ballot by getting signatures from the voters with no action for the Board of Supervisors could go straight on the ballot without meet and confer first, but there would have to be meet and confer after.
Before it was implemented.
Before it's implemented. If it passed, it would have to go through meet and confer before it's implemented.
There are two kinds of meet and confer. One is meet and confer and don't come to an agreement, so the employer imposes. And the other is meet and confer and you have to come to an agreement before you can implement.
Kind of. Then it gets really complicated. Maybe
Okay,
that's
never
beyond
mind.
the presentation today. I think the bottom line for
That'll
folks in
be
Sonoma
on
County
the
is,
last
you know what, yeah, right, if the Board of Supervisors wanted to put a ballot measure on to change Measure P. It's clear that they would have to have their staff, meaning, county council and HR and IOLERO, go to the applicable unions and have conversation with them about how that was gonna affect them before it went on to the ballot.
Mhm.
And if the voters decided to put something on the ballot directly themselves, they absolutely can do that, but we should all expect that the county will be required to go through meet and confer after, before any of those items can be implemented. So one way or another, there's going to be meet and confer in the future if we change these provisions about IOLERO and Measure P.
Outside of Measure P and outside of ballots. Those changes. Would those require a meet and confer or not so much?
Well, then we get into the Claremont test. Now, that could be another 20 minutes if you want to talk
Okay,
about that.
well, I guess I'm just a
But-
little concerned
Yeah.
that this could be used sort of, as a tool against us. And again, so I guess that's what I want to make sure, we're doing things in a way to prevent that from occurring, if possible, like.
Well,
What qualifies as meet and confer? Like if we bring in Sheriff Ingram and talk to him about something, is that considered, that's done?
No,
Check?
that is definitely not meet and confer. You have to talk
That's
to the
review.
applicable union. Yeah, well, let me say this in a way that's really clear, because I know there are a lot of other people, including PERB, that might look at this recording later.
Yep.
There is no question in California that the County of Sonoma is a state actor that employs people who are subject to the meet and confer process and have that as a right, as a condition of their employment. And it would be unlawful for us to try to subvert their right to meet and confer.
Of course, absolutely.
So as a general rule, we should expect anytime we're going to change a disciplinary system, which is in part what IOLERO is, right? Or that we're going to change the way people are interviewed or investigated around their conduct at work. We should expect that there's going to have to be a meet and confer process, and we have an obligation as an employer to go through that process with all of our employees, any of them that are affected. Now, anytime we have provisions like that, we'll get some legal advice about in great detail about what aspects of the proposal do and do not trigger meet and confer. But we should just always assume that anytime we're making a change to IOLERO, Measure P, for that kind of work, or the way in which, sheriff's personnel do their work, almost always there's going to be a meet and confer process. We should just start with that assumption.
Sounds good.
So for example, in our attempts to change the extremism in policing, where we are now asking as part of our recommendation to the sheriff that their policy be changed, requiring an attestation every period of whatever period of time. That is now changing the working conditions of those deputies who now have an additional condition of employment to attest to this on a specific timeline. Is that something where basic policy changes where we need to now, before presenting it to the sheriff, sit down with the unions and discuss with them this potential policy recommendation? And the reason I say it like that is we will never have policies ever changing with the sheriff's department if that's required. They just won't do it.
That's exactly
You
why.
know what we might want to, do, if you want to get into this in more detail, is have, someone from the county who specializes in this process come talk to you further about it. But I would say there are a couple parts of your question that I can answer really clearly. One is the question about whether any particular change in what an employee does triggers meet and confer is subject to a rather complicated legal test. And so we just get legal advice every time we're making a change like that to see if it applies or doesn't apply. And if you really want to get into brass tacks about these last couple PERB decisions and the decision from the appellate court, there clearly was an agreement between PERB and the appellate court about which tests apply or how you interpret them. So that's actually a pretty complicated area in some ways. You get into things called effects bargaining, for example, which it gets into some real nuance about how changes in rules affect employees and whether meet and confer gets triggered. And then what happens if you don't reach agreement in meet and confer, as Nancy mentioned, right? I think as a starting point, it's probably a good idea for the CAC to just assume anytime we're making a change or recommending a change to the county with respect to anything at the sheriff's office, it's probably going to go through meet and confer before it gets implemented. Second, I would say, don't look at meet and confer as necessarily blocking ideas that you have. It is simply a mandated conversation between the employer and the employees about whether those rules work for everybody. It is not designed in the law as a way for the employees to ultimately block any idea that the employer might have. It simply requires conversation about those changes before they're implemented. And then the last thing that I would say is it will be really important for the county of Sonoma to ensure that when we go through that meet and confer process, that's done through a set of existing channels with county council and human resources involved. So it's never going to be the job of CAC or IOLERO directly to do that by themselves. To some extent, I've been involved in meet and confer with some of these unions, but I always do that with our council and our HR folks there as a team. And there's a process by which the employer, the county, acknowledges who the team is going to be and gives them the authority to have that conversation. And then we have that conversation in a very structured way because there's a great deal of law about how it's supposed to go. And making sure you memorialize in a thoughtful way what the conversation was and how it went along. So
Not just a screaming match.
it is not, but nor is it a casual conversation, right? It is structured. And so you as the CAC will not need to worry about doing that conversation directly. So when you come with a policy idea, don't feel that you have to go meet and confer with you. We really can't at this level. It's not appropriate for this group to do that work, given the way state law is written. But keep in mind that if you take it to the sheriff's office and the sheriffs agree about it, the more specific detail that you have and the more agreement there is between the CAC and the sheriff at that stage, the easier it will be to get through the meet and confer process in a way that everyone finds palatable. Okay, so I do think it's a great idea for the CAC and the sheriff to talk about the policy recommendations. It will be essential for the sheriff at least to come up with an idea of what policy they want to move forward before it goes to meet and confer. It needs to be a specific idea. And then if that specific idea is one that the CAC likes too, even better. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The agreement, the letter agreement specifically excludes CAC. So if we go to the sheriff and say, we think you should do this policy, and the sheriff said, I'm going to implement this policy. The fact that CAC recommended it, does that change? Does that change anything? Would the sheriff have to go through meet and confer every time he wants to change a policy?
Well, as a general rule, anytime any sheriff wants to change policies in any way that affect the working conditions of the employees, there almost always is going to be a meet and confer process, whether the idea came from someone inside the sheriff's staff, the CAC, a member of the board of supervisors, or just a great idea the sheriff had one day.
Okay.
Yeah, so the origin of the idea doesn't ultimately matter. I do think, though, on a purely practical level, setting the law aside for a second, when there's real community consensus around an idea, and there's already a well-known process like the CAC that created that idea, and the sheriff says, I'm going to pick that up too, then the sheriff's position in the meet and confer process is stronger and clearer than it might be otherwise. The sheriff will then be better prepared to manage that process in a way that gets a policy we all like. So the work we do here at the CAC has tremendous value in the meet and confer process. And in fact, the more that there's conversation with the sheriff's office as you come up with your recommendations, I think that the better that meet and confer process will be.
Would you ever recommend we change the letter agreement to include a letter agreement that includes CAC and sets of guidelines?
I'm not exactly sure I understand what that means, but why don't you and I talk about that offline?
You got it.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll open it up for public comment. If you wish to address the CAC or the director's report, please come to the front. Or just stand up. I think it's.
I have a couple of quick questions. One is when we go to the ballot to update Measure P, because it's not an if, it's a when. We went to the ballot once, we're gonna have to. Now, IOLERO is gonna have to come from a vote of the people. So, and things are gonna change. How long should we allow in our planning for the meet and confer process if we're gonna try and get the supervisors to put it on the ballot? You know, is this a 6-month thing? Is this a year thing? You know, planning timeline, how long should you allow for meet and confer is my first question. And then the other one just has to do with the appeal that was filed. I know that Herb had appealed to not get the appeal published. And I'm just wondering if we know if it was ever published or not.
Thank you. Any other?
I just want to reiterate what I say all the time, that this points out that there's not enough community outreach. The community doesn't know what you're doing. We can't have any public pressure on the sheriff's office unless the public actually knows about it. So this relates to this particular, it relates to Measure P. It also relates to the extremism issue. If the public found out that the sheriff's office was saying, no, you don't get to ask any questions about, you know, they can be as extreme as they want. We're not doing anything about it. You'd hear from the public if they knew about it. So I don't know how you're going to do it because it's not happening now. And it's got to happen. I truly believe that this body doesn't need to exist if that doesn't happen. Because people don't know what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the audience? Do you have any hands raised? Okay, thank you. Then we'll go ahead and close public comment. John, did you have answers to the question?
I think, it's hard to say how long meet and confer takes because the rule isn't that it takes a specific amount of time, but it should be a sufficient amount of time for good faith exploration of all the issues involved, however long that is. So there isn't any one yardstick for that. And trying to set a deadline for it is usually considered an unfair labor practice. So one cannot say we have to have this done in a week or we have to have this done in a month. So I don't want to put us into that position.
Doesn't
If
really
I-
contemplate the idea of it going on a ballot, does it?
No.
So if they knew it was gonna go on ballot, they could intentionally delay it until.
So I think the thing to remember here is that there's two different rules. If a board of supervisors is going to put it on the ballot, then the meet and confer has to happen first. And if the voters put it on the ballot, then it happens after, and then one just has to adapt either way. So, you know, the voters put it on first, and then there's meet and confer after. It could be quite a long time before any of that material could be implemented. It could be a year. And the ultimate implementation might be somewhat different than the ballot measure appears. And there is, in my opinion, lack of consensus among attorneys in this field about whether the ballot measure or a negotiated agreement would ultimately control, but I think it's pretty clear that Herb would conclude that the negotiated agreement controls over the ballot measure, even if the voters all voted for it by 90%. So that's a challenge. If I don't know the answer about whether the original appellate decision was published or not. I recall that was a debate, and I don't remember how that was resolved. I think it was published, but I can't be sure of that. So I didn't check that. Yeah, and there were some other things I was gonna report on tonight. I'm gonna skip all of those because of the hour.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and close this item and move on to item number 8, the CAC ad hoc reports. We'll start with community engagement. Do you have anything to report?
There was, I don't know if anyone went to land pass that we sent out. But I know we got went to the old Courtyard Square, right in the second for the Easter, and then there's the Latino Family Summit that's coming up at SSU, if anyone is interested. I'm going, but I'm taking parents and students, so I won't be able to take them, but I'll see you there if you go. And that's April 15th from 8:30 to 3. Do you want to report back on Soul Courtyard Square and how that went?
It went well. They had more people than they expected. I got, everything was, everything was gone. I had to go to SRPD and say, I'm leaving, and they're like, oh no, we have dum-dums. So I was giving dum-dums to the little kids, but it was good. I did get a complaint, so that was good. And people picked up annual reports, so that was good. So it went good.
Awesome. Thank you. Extremism and policing, anything to report?
Not beyond our. I think we did.
Thank you. So we'll move on to item 9, which is open time for public comment. If anyone in the audience wishes to address the CC, you can just stand up and we'll give you the 3 minutes. This is for items not on the agenda.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight to everyone that the budget meetings are coming up 8th of April, the 20th to the 27th. So this would be a really good time to get and dig into that sharp budget. So if you have any input to the board of supervisors, I think that would be really important. The other thing that I just like to throw out there, I've been disappointed that you don't see a supervisor ever in one of these meetings. There's 5 of them, you have 12 meetings. I would suggest that maybe when you meet with the board of your representative, you say, would you be willing to come twice a year to the IOLERO meeting and publicize it to all of your district people? And that might be a way to get more people engaged per what Susan was talking about, because it is distressing. There's so few people on the list and so few people in the room on such important issues. And I know you guys are doing great work. And I know the community really does support you. They just, if they find out about it. So that's just a couple of suggestions I have, because I just feel like the board should be more engaged with what's going on here. More than just the once a year IOLERO.
Thank you. Anyone else who's present in the room? Okay, do you have any hands raised?
Brian.
Okay. Brian, will go ahead and start your 3 minutes. Oh, when you're ready.
She did on cheap.
Oops.
Thank you. So nobody responds to my emails or voicemails or answers the phone. Nobody responds to my requests for public records. The county supervisors, Office of Legal Counsel, DA's office have continuously, openly disregarded and openly violated various serious laws, obviously expecting to get away with it. There were no records made of any of the misconduct that occurred. The incident occurred right under a camera and in front of witnesses, including the commanding officer. According to the commanding officer, Lieutenant Melissa Parmenter, I was not resisting. According to the third-party witnesses, including the bystander witness who saw the entire incident, and Officer Robert Sagan of Roanoke Park Police, I was polite and cooperative. I've been diagnosed with organic brain injury from the carotid hold, and the injury to my kidney due to the knee to my back was also much worse than any injury before or since, like a broken wrist, arm, ankle, dislocated thumb, or serious back injury. I want my case resolved. It's been 6 years. Nobody else involved in this is being nearly as patient or courteous as I have been. The court system has been subverted into a hamster wheel, and they have used the most fundamental human rights like a carrot on a stick to compel me into labor I shouldn't have to do. The county has spent an estimated $1.5 million defending against my valid claim for compensation. I want to move on with my life. And I also want my right to not be tortured and nearly murdered for literally no reason in front of witnesses and under a camera intact. Per the legal requirement under Rule 26, Part F of Federal Civil Procedure, the parties must consider the possibilities for promptly settling or resolving the case. I would also add that Sonoma County should acknowledge the third-party evidence that the carotid hold was applied with extreme force for an extended length of time and that I was polite and cooperative throughout the entire process. I'm asking IOLERO to recommend to the county to make an actual good faith effort to resolve the claim.
Thank you, Brian. Do you have any other hands raised? Okay, seeing there is no additional public comment, we'll go ahead and close open time and move on to item 10. Request for future agenda items. Does anyone from this week have any items? Otherwise, we wanted to mention that Nancy and I will be working on kind of merging the commitment to civil engagement and design team alliance because it is a little repetitive, and we'll bring a draft for everyone to review and approve. So that way it still captures what it's intended to, but we cut out some of the repetition. And then we will be looking into changing the meeting date, possibly. I'll let John talk so I don't misinform anyone. Go ahead.
You're doing great.
Okay.
So, don't let him come across that way. But, I did want to just ask, if there's any feedback from the members of the CAC about this meeting location. This is the first time we've met in this space. And I wanted to see if it's meeting your needs, if you like it.
Yeah.
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 It's an upgrade to the last one.
Okay.
I like it a lot, and it seems like the technology works, which I think is
Mhm.
a priority since we're doing hybrid meetings right now, and it's clean, it's safe, it's a great location.
Well, then, what I think.
At some point, and maybe after we stop doing hybrid, I think it would be important for us to be moving around a little bit more. I mean, I think that one of the issues about who can come here and, from various parts of the county, we have a large county, and I think that we ought to be taking the initiative to go out and meet people rather than expecting them always to come into Santa Rosa. So I know that with this technology, that's really hard, and that we're trying to make this possible for them to meet with us over Zoom, and that's really great too. But I just think we should also be moving around at some point.
Okay, and then it was also brought up that changing the meeting from the first Monday might be a consideration because there is a meeting of the
NAACP's monthly meeting, so that anybody who wants to go to that, it has an automatic conflict every month, so.
So we're looking into that, and we might bring something more specific for us to decide on at the next meeting.
Yeah, if this space works, then we'll see what other dates the space might be available. And we'll bring a proposal for the next meeting. And that'll be an agenda item, so that the public knows our thought process about moving date.
Yes, and then after that agenda item, if the decision changes, we will have to update our bylaws, so that'll be something that will get triggered automatically. So if there are no additional points to discuss, then we move on to item 11, which is adjourning the meeting, and it is 7:59. Right under 2 hours.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
You bring the wine next time.